Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Ricci, the Director for Alumni Relations and Engagement for the School of Arts and Sciences. If this is your first virtual Scarlet speaker event, I'd like to welcome you. And if you are a return attendee, I would like to welcome you back. As a reminder, we've muted everyone's videos and cameras. That way there's no background noise during the presentation. We ask that you use the question and answer option to submit questions for Janet. As soon as she's done her talk, then we will take questions. If we have any follow-up questions or need any sort of clarification, we will be able to unmute you so that you can give us some more information. This event is also going to be recorded and we will share it with you after the fact. So if there's anyone that you think might want to see this, you can pass it along. And also as a reminder, please know that these events are not just for Rutgers alums. So if you ever get an invitation and there's a topic that you think someone might enjoy learning about, please forward the invitation and we would love to have them. Now I would like to introduce Janet Golden. Janet Golden is a professor emerita at Rutgers, where she specializes in the history of medicine, childhood, women's history, and American social history. Her most recent book is Babies Made Us Modern: How Infants Brought Americans into the 20th Century. She is also the author, editor, or co-editor of 9 other books. Janet co-edits the Critical Issues in Health and Medicine series at Rutgers University Press and the Philadelphia Inquirer's public health blog, The Public Health. Her work has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, the National Endowment for Humanities, the Commonwealth Fund, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, among other funders. Please join me in welcoming Janet Golden.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to quickly share my screen, so you don't need to look at me. You can look at 1918. Let's see if I can get that open. And there we go. Let's take a look at some viruses. What I'm going to do is give you a few questions, show you a little bit about 1918 and 2020, answer some of your questions as best I can, and then go back to talking about influenza 1918. I'm putting this up here because I think it's fascinating to look at these viruses. The HN virus is our sort of seasonal flu that we get flu shots for every year. It mutates very quickly. We're currently dealing with a coronavirus, and I think the most important thing for you to remember is I'm a historian, not a virologist, so if you have medical or science questions, I'm probably not going to be able to answer them. But I am going to start off with a couple of questions for you to think about, questions that we need to answer as a society, and then I'll get right to 1918. So one question is, how does our national response to COVID-19 reflect the departure of racial justice from our political priorities? I think it's an important time to ask that question. We want to ask how our public health narrative keeps talking about personal responsibilities, maybe rather than the structures of power that require transformation to achieve public health ends. Is there a kind of victim blaming going on during this pandemic? Oh, you got sick because, and it's kind of in contrast to the heroism we are giving to our frontline healthcare workers. Does it make some people to mourn their deaths more than others? And what does that really mean? What makes this pandemic different? I think everybody would answer, we have a hyper media world. We have a sort of technological velocity of interactions and a demand for instant responses and solutions. Maybe that's a little faster than it was in 1918. And of course, in 1918, our influenza traveled by ship and by train, and today it's in the air, literally. So let's go to 1918, which is often called the forgotten pandemic. And the reason for that is pretty clear from this picture. There were millions and millions of casualties in World War I. World War I was front page news. So when the pandemic broke out, Americans were reading about life overseas in the trenches. And there was some censorship of pandemic news as well. We know that the United States entered World War I relatively late, so the loss of American lives was high, but as you'll see, 53,000 in World War I, but pandemic deaths in the United States are estimated to have been about 675,000. And here's a little quote from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention about the total deaths worldwide, possibly as high as 100 million. It's very hard to count the deaths in Africa, in Asia, where we know there were millions of deaths, but not good reporting. And just as a reminder, influenza was not what we call a reportable disease in 1918. Other things to look at. One of the things that we saw in 1918, and we'll get to today, is this belief as influenza was spreading across the globe that somehow our superior civilization would prevent us from being infected so much by that 1918 influenza. This is from during an earlier pandemic of or an epidemic of bubonic plague in San Francisco that was, people believe, came from Chinatown, not from rats. And let's see if we can go on here. Oh, I don't know why. I want to point something out here and take a careful look at this. We had an epidemic of what was called the Russian flu in 1899 to 1900. It was first reported in Russia, and that's how it got the name. And I want you to remember this because it's going to affect our mortality rates in 1918. So just a quick look there. 1918 pandemic, you'll see the highest mortality rates were young people between the ages of, say, 20 and 50. And that's because, and the older folks did not suffer so much in 1918. And that's because many of them had had that Russian flu. It was a related flu, and they developed some immunity from that. So it was these people of the younger age who are more often victims of the 1918 pandemic. Today, in our COVID case, we see, of course, that is the elderly who are most at risk. And that's quite an impressive one there. And here's the most recent data from the CDC comparing influenza deaths with COVID deaths, or seasonal influenza with COVID deaths. So a very different pattern we're experiencing today. Another thing I want you to remember, there were 3 waves of influenza between 1918 and 1919. In the spring of 1918, we had the wave at the very left, what I call a little hill. Then in the fall and early winter of 1918, we had what I call the Alp. And then we had another 3rd wave in 1919. It was higher than the first wave, but not as severe. So today you'll often hear people talking about, will there be a 2nd wave of COVID? And I think they're often referencing this 1918 wave. And again, please remember this, because we're gonna raise some issues about this later. 1918, there was a lot of blame going around. We called it the Spanish flu originally because the first reports came from newspapers in Spain. But with World War I going on, there was a lot of sense that perhaps it was caused by the Germans, that they're spreading this disease, our enemies overseas. And of course, today we have some of this same blaming a virus on where it starts. I don't think that that's surprising to anyone. In 1918, we had a lot of deaths in what we call congregate institutions, deaths among minority populations. Here's American Indians, Alaska Natives really had tremendous suffering there. Some communities lost almost every single resident. And it was pretty brutal there in those congregate institutions, as well as in prisons orphanages, etc. And of course, today we see the same kind of thing. High death rates in jails, in ICE facilities, in meat packing plants, and our highest rate on the Navajo reservation, where there's poor public health infrastructure. So, how do you respond to the flu in 1918? Avoid needless crowding, our Surgeon General said. Influenza is a crowd disease. That may sound familiar. Smother your coughs and sneezes. So again, probably sounds familiar. Your nose, not your mouth, was made to breathe through. So no more mouth breathing, which was a common criticism of people who are called mouth breathers in 1918, if it looks like they were spreading influenza. Today we get pretty much the same thing. Cover your mouth when you cough. Now we get the avoid touching your eyes, washing your hands. So not very different. Masks. Yes. Masks were required, and people were arrested in San Francisco in pretty big numbers for not wearing their masks. And today we, again, as then, have protests against wearing masks. So that may look pretty familiar. I kind of like the anti-mask meeting there. Looks very exciting. Now it probably would be posted on Twitter, I guess, to go to the anti-mask meeting. This was the most arresting image for me in the COVID outbreak, the image of the mass graves being dug in New York City, because I had a very vivid memory of the mass graves being dug in 1918 in this image that I had been teaching to my Rutgers students year after year. So it just really struck me on an emotional level, but I thought I'd share that. Caring for the sick in 1918, people, as you can see, we had the early version of personal protective equipment. And of course, here is our modern version of that. We had a lot of volunteerism, as we do today, people helping to deliver groceries to neighbors, people helping out however they can, sewing masks. And there we had it in 1918, helping to raise money to furnish hospital beds, making masks, making bandages. So similar. We did have, of course, segregated hospitals in much of 1918. This is from Camp Bowie in Texas. And we have field hospitals in 1918, outdoor hospitals, and we had them in New York City in 2020. So I think it will look somewhat familiar to you. The wards were a little more crowded in 1918. We tend to have more individual rooms, although if you recall the earlier image, we did have a lot of people living in the hallways outside of emergency rooms in our most crowded COVID units. One of the things that was new in 1918 was what was then called the motorized ambulance, the automobile ambulance. And these were big battlefield developments as well, because if you think about evacuating people from the battlefield, if you load people onto that horse-drawn cart and then you gallop away to the hospital, then you got to pull the reins and stop the horse. It's a pretty bumpy ride at the end when you're stopping, and people found that these motorized ambulances did a much better job with their braking. And you didn't have to carry a lot of hay to feed them, you just needed the gasoline. Other things were also similar back then. Quarantine and isolation, separating people who are manifesting signs of the disease, restricted the movement of those who might have acquired an infection via contact. So I'm sure this sounds very familiar. We had a lot of unproven remedies and quack remedies being sold in 1918. And my absolute favorite was onions. People believed, and this was a common folk belief about the curative power of onions, But people thought if you ate enough onions, you might be able to prevent getting the flu. So a lot of people tried to eat them at every meal. And there's a story about one woman who made her sick child live buried up to his neck in raw onions, head to toe, for 3 days. Other remedies, people tried gargling, people tried smoking cigarettes or cigars or pipes because smoking was then thought to open up the lungs. It was actually a treatment for asthma and chest ailments, which we shouldn't do today. People tried alcohol. That's always a popular remedy. Wearing bags of asafoetida around their necks and stuffing various things up their noses. And today we get a number of other unproven remedies that people like. One thing that was the same is we started using what was called convalescent serum in 1918. The idea is that you take antibodies or blood from people who've recovered from a disease, you filter it through animals. Those are guinea pigs there creating anti-diphtheria toxin, and then you inject it into people. And we found in 1918, people went back in 2012 during, I think, one of the avian flu epidemics, and found that it actually did lower the death rate then. And of course, now we're using convalescent plasma to get it donated and given to patients. So something very similar. A lot of people have asked me when I've given these talks to talk about African Americans in 1918. And they had a lower influenza mortality rate overall in cities, as best as we can tell. Again, influenza was not reportable. Why was it? Was it underreported? Probably not. The African American press did a pretty good job of reporting this. Secondly, people were, the belief was that people contracted the flu during that milder first wave. People in African American communities lived in poor housing. They experienced that first wave. They got the flu because they were maybe more immune compromised. They had higher rates of tuberculosis, other things. So by having that first milder wave of influenza, they might have had lower rates when the more serious outbreak occurred later in 1918. And segregation may have kept down some exposure because they remained within their own community. Excuse me for 1 minute. I'm getting an emergency call. Be right back.
I'll pop on here real quick. Janet was having work done in her house, and she had a feeling that they might arrive because, of course, they would arrive in the middle of this. So that is where she has run off to let them know to come back. In the meantime, we have some questions.
I'm back.
Perfect. Here she is.
And I want to credit Vanessa Northington Campbell and other wonderful research on African American work during the influenza outbreak. There were segregated medical and nursing organizations, segregated hospitals and clinics, and a lot of public health information spread in the African American press. And I'm just giving a shout out to our Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital and Training School here in Philadelphia, where I live, and to the nurses, because nursing care was the most critical part of influenza care in 1918. We didn't have preventions, we didn't have treatments, we only had comfort care and watching you and keeping your fever down, and if you were lucky, giving you some convalescent serum, which we didn't have those automatic IVs that dripped into you. The nurses had to stand there and kind of count the drips and get them into you. So that is what really saved lives in 1918. At the same time, we have to remember that many of our physicians and nurses were overseas with the American Expeditionary Force. So people kind of had to take care of themselves in many cases. They had to really look out for each other and only go to the doctors that were remaining at home if they had an emergency. Now, what about other groups? Immigrant groups, new immigrant populations, had much higher rates of death. They didn't experience perhaps the 1900 Russian flu epidemic because they were living often in rural areas in southern Italy and Eastern Europe. So they had very little exposure to past influenza outbreaks. And there were fewer physicians and nurses of the same ethnic groups to provide care in the way that the African American community could do. So just as an example, here's the Italian hospital in Philadelphia where people were treated. But the death rate was unfortunately much higher in the immigrant community because they tended to get it during that second wave, which was much more serious. And I'm going to stop here, answer a few questions, and then I'll go on and do a quick overview of influenza in Philadelphia, where our story is much more interesting. So, Dana, do you want to read some questions to me?
Absolutely. So we got two just now. One, Michael Adler. What can we learn from the mistakes of Philadelphia, where he currently lives, during the 1918 pandemic?
What I'm going to say, Michael, hold on, and we'll get there in 1 minute.
All right, we'll keep that one. Let's, okay, I think I'm going to pronounce this right. Joseph Robinson. Is it not as appropriate to compare today's COVID-19 to the 1957-58 and 1968-69 flu pandemics, or the 1940s, early 1950s polio epidemics, as it is to the 1918-1919 flu pandemic?
Yes, well, all of those earlier pandemics, influenza pandemics that you mentioned, were HN flus. So it's, in a sense, it's not fair to compare the a brand new coronavirus. There were only 4 known before, and they're kind of our constantly circulating flu viruses, to any of these 1918 epidemics. But 1918 was the deadliest pandemic, and it appears that unfortunately our coronavirus is on track to go there. The polio epidemic is something else. Polio is, of course, a viral disease, but the polio epidemic crippled a lot of people. It was not that deadly. It was a most feared disease among middle-class white populations about their children. It was not as deadly as other diseases then that were killing children, but it got a lot of, because of who it, and of course with the FDR getting polio, it kind of got a greater amount of attention than the deaths from polio may have warranted. But yes, again, they're all viral diseases. We didn't really discover viruses until the 1930s. So in 1918 and in the polio epidemics, there was a hunt for the germ, the bacteria, which of course they didn't find. We do have periodic outbreaks of much deadlier influenzas, but we have been pretty lucky if we get our influenza cocktails correct, to be able to lower those death rates. And I will point out something interesting that I only learned a few years ago, which is there's a different influenza seasonal flu shot in the southern hemisphere than there is here in the northern hemisphere. So if you're going to be living in Australia in what we would call summer, you're going to need a different flu shot. Give me another question, Dana, please.
All right, these are some that we got pre-submitted. Someone said, how long did it take to create a vaccine for the 1918 virus, if in fact they did ever develop a vaccine?
I don't believe they ever developed a vaccine because, as I said, we didn't know it was viral. Our influenza cocktails that we get seasonally come much, much later. And a vaccine is really a preventive that takes a lot of time to develop. So when you get your seasonal flu, you're getting 3 or 4 strains of what the scientists figure is the best, is likely to be circulating in the winter when it comes to us. So that but the 1918 influenza was an HN flu. It has, every once in a while, with our global warming, people sort of, bodies emerge from the permafrost that died in 1918, and they can sort of take a look at those earlier viruses and know what they are. But they're always going to be changing, these HN viruses. We're not going to defeat them. We can get the seasonal influenza shots and keep them at bay that year. Okay, another question?
Okay. So someone had asked, which we just answered, that was there research for a vaccine being conducted? We know that answer, but the second part of it was, do you think the world today is in a better position than it was in 1918 to 1920 to deal with the pandemic?
I can only say, I hope so. It's hard for, I'm a historian, so I'm only used to talking about the past. But yes, we have a different public global health infrastructure, some public health infrastructure. We have a lot more scientific knowledge. So hopefully we will be able to combat this COVID, whether by finding effective treatments that make it less deadly, or by finding a vaccine, although we have a long way to go. I think I'll jump onto the Philadelphia story real quick.
Sounds
and get
good.
back to some more questions.
Sure.
So our first Philadelphia reported death during the 1918 pandemic occurs at our Naval Yard on September 11th. 1918, our military personnel was struck, and by September 23rd, there were 600 cases among our military personnel, and by the 28th, there were 500 cases in our civilian population, with 149 civilian deaths. Our highest death rate here in Philadelphia will be a single day in October when 759 people died. Ultimately, we'll lose 12,687. Now, I think what that question was referring to was our 1918 Liberty Loan Parade to sell Liberty bonds for our American Expeditionary Force fighting in World War I. I'm sorry, the picture's a little blurry. It attracted 200,000 people lining Broad Street, and our local newspaper, the Public Ledger, said this was the greatest procession the city had ever seen. And the following week, there were 4,541 new cases of influenza. The rate was 9 times higher than the week before the flu. So crowding, as the Surgeon General had said, this is a crowd disease. Rupert Blue had urged Philadelphia not to host the parade, but the local public health commissioner, Dr. Cruzen, said, go ahead. And we did not have good results. And again, I want to stress, these were, you know, we had our young men overseas, but there were many young people who came out to watch the parade or who were infected during this outbreak. So we have, when you're losing a population from, say, age 18 to 50, you're losing often the main source of household income. You're losing a workforce. People are becoming widows and widowers. Children are being orphaned. It was a terrible, terrible thing that we lived through in 1918. The city did respond by what we today call social distancing. They closed schools, they closed saloons, they closed churches, they closed sporting events, they closed theaters, and they prohibited public gatherings. So that's very familiar. And people said, if you can avoid going to work, don't go to work. If you're suffering from influenza, skip work. And a lot of citizens were quite angry at this. They said, I don't understand why I have to do this. I feel fine. I will say there were a lot of wonderful volunteer efforts in Philadelphia. The Automobile Club and what was called the Auto Car Company of Philadelphia supplemented ambulance services and transported the doctors and nurses who went on house calls. Taxis gave rides to visiting nurses. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association provided off-duty policemen to work as stretcher bearers. Firefighters delivered medical assistance and food. Teachers stepped up and volunteered. The city established a hotline, and the Child Welfare Federation coordinated a lot of efforts. So they divided the city into by districts, and then when they get calls, they try and send people there, although sometimes they sent too many people to one house and kind of skipped the next block. But we had thousands of nurses and physicians on military duty. So one of the ways we got healthcare was to tell the juniors and seniors from our medical colleges, which had closed during the epidemic, to come out and attend patients. The city opened 10 voluntary temporary hospitals, sometimes in clubs or in churches. We did provide a lot of volunteer care. One of the problems we had, as we saw in that image before, was dealing with the dead. Our morgue at the start of the pandemic here in Philadelphia only could store 36 bodies, and the corpses in numbers way beyond that kept arriving. So they ended up being stacked up in the basement. A number of professional embalmers refused to work on the corpses as they started to decompose. The stench built up in the building, and then they had to open the doors to get the stench out, and then sidewalk gawkers would come by. And finally, the city stepped up and developed 5 new temporary morgues. And the Secretary of War, our federal agency that preceded the Department of Defense, Newton D. Baker, sent embalmers to Philadelphia at the request of the mayor. The National Council of Defense organized our woodworking companies and contracted for the building of coffins to bury Philadelphians. And they actually instituted price control, so you couldn't gouge people on the price of coffins. But there was so much demand that funeral homes had to hire armed security guards to protect the coffins. There's some pictures from Philadelphia with our masks. Spit Spreads Death. I know that's the title of an exhibit at our College of Physicians of Philadelphia. I want to say something about spitting, which I know is why you tuned in today, and I'll be done shortly. And that is, there was a big effort in the era, in the late 19th century, to stop people from spitting as a way of preventing tuberculosis. Yeah, because it's spread by large droplets. Well, that had the paradoxical effect of encouraging spitting, because if you were to spit into a handkerchief, people would say, aha, you have tuberculosis, don't come to work, you're losing your job, you're losing your house. So people would spit as a way of saying, see, I don't have tuberculosis. That was not a good outcome. But here are some of our masked people from around the city and around the country. Looks very familiar, I'm sure. And we did have an election in 1918. By then, the worst was over of that second wave, but they did fumigate those polling places, and we were able to vote. By October 25th, the number of cases were falling in Philadelphia, and by the time of the election, that second wave was pretty much over. So that's the Philadelphia story. I'm going to stop and take some more questions. So go ahead, Dana.
All right. So then we'll circle back to Michael's question in that, what can we learn from the mistakes of Philadelphia?
I would say, if the Surgeon General tells you influenza or COVID is a crowd disease, stay out of crowded indoor or even outdoor places, you might want to listen, and you might want to wear your mask.
All right, we have a question from Valeria. What was done to protect the medical student body who basically replaced physicians during this time? Is there any data on the mortality rates for the students and healthcare workers from 1918?
As you saw in the image there, people did wear the masks and the gowns, but yes, the young physicians, nurses, the adults and the students, or the younger ones who were students, succumbed in great numbers to the influenza because they were in the prime vulnerable group. They were children during that earlier 1899 Russian flu. They hadn't had as much flu experience, and we did lose a lot of them, both in the United States and overseas. We had a lot of volunteer nurses in our base hospitals over there and our women's hospitals. And, you know, when World War I broke out, people could enlist with their friends and neighbors from the same town, and then they might go to, say, Fort Dix and get training. And then from there, they'd be put on crowded troop trains and go to forts in Kentucky or forts in North Carolina. And those training sites that they went to didn't have large infirmaries, and suddenly you might have to erect them very quickly, have thousands of them filled, have volunteer nurses and nursing students and nursing sisters from the community in there taking care of them. And yes, they would succumb to that 1918 influenza. So it was a very, very deadly virus.
Okay, next question from Rudy Bell. Boccaccio describes major social divisiveness during the Black Death Plague starting in 1348. Was there similar social division in the 1918 pandemic, and how do you think it relates to the divisiveness in the US today?
Well, I think I think today we're in a very different situation. I'll get to that in a minute. I think you saw the kind of trying to blame others for bringing this deadly disease to us in 1918, whether it was the Spanish flu or the Hun flu, or even labeling in 1899 the Russian flu, or today some of the blaming of China for the flu. So there was that kind of social divisiveness. On the other hand, with World War I going on, and with our men and some women in uniform or volunteering overseas, there was quite a bit of patriotism of we're all in this together, and we should sort of hang together as we fight this Hun flu that's come and attacked us. At the same time, there was also a fair amount of tamping down of influenza information. So I've looked at letters from people in the military to family members back home, and they'll say, gee, everybody here is gargling and we've got the flu and they're dropping like flies. Do you have anything like that back home? They really didn't know. Or people writing from back home saying, gee, we have a bad outbreak here. I'm sure you're safer in your military training camp, which was not the case. So I think in this particular instance, the kind of patriotism around World War I dampened the internal divisions. Of course, it was a much more segregated society. So as I showed, we had our African-American community much more segregated, lower death rate, had their own hospitals, immigrant communities, had their own neighborhoods, their own providers. And that, yes, there was some blaming going on, but I think it was particularly interesting with the conjunction with World War I.
Okay, Michelle asked, do you know if there was any kind of discussion on the economic effects of closing businesses and not going to work during that period?
I have not read what I would call the federal reports on that, so I'm not going to answer that. But yes, people complained bitterly when they lost their jobs, they lost their businesses. Of course, there was a lot of complaints about that, and people wanting to get back to work. What made a difference is if you think about it, the flu is arriving in mid-September, it's gone by mid-October. So the consequences are far different than than a COVID that shut us down for over 100 days now. So and it took a while for the shutdowns to happen in different places. What I think was particularly interesting, I didn't have time to get into this, Philadelphia, for example, closed its schools. The city of New York kept its public schools open with the idea, rather than having children at home in tenements all day where they're likely to be exposed, they can come to school and be examined by the school nurses and be kept out if they're sick, but otherwise get some care from the nurses. So, and the death rates were no different in Philadelphia where they closed the schools than in New York where they didn't, in terms of deaths of young people. So probably a good way to think about influenza in 1918 is like a kaleidoscope, where there are different experiences in different cities, depending on the leadership, the severity. Some communities sort of closed themselves off, let no one in, escaped influenza entirely. A number of them actually college communities. Bryn Mawr College, for example, basically closed its gates. People dropped things off and they brought in the food, but nobody came in, and they escaped. I hope that, but as to, what's going on now, I'm not going to jump in on that one.
Okay. Paul had asked if you could maybe elaborate a little more on how the schools did adapt to the outbreak before remote instruction by telecommunication was possible.
Well, in some places, the schools just closed and you were home or on the streets until schools reopened again. So that's how they adapted. New York City had a very powerful public health leader, S. Josephine Baker, who said, keep the kids in schools, we'll send nurses into the schools and we'll check their health. But school attendance was not, we didn't have online school. We didn't send kids home with workbooks or assignments. We just closed schools.
Okay. Susan asked, why does it seem that the 1918 epidemic has been erased from history narratives prior to this pandemic?
Well, again, the answer is World War I. I think if I were to look at all of you out there and I said, did you learn about World War I in school? Or had you heard of World War I? Everybody would raise their hand. If I said, did you learn about the 10 times deadlier 1918 influenza, fewer hands would go up. We just have not, and I'm preaching as a medical historian here, we have not really paid attention to earlier pandemics, to our healthcare evolution, to our healthcare infrastructure. We just haven't, and to health disparities. We just have not paid enough attention in our classrooms. And that's why people didn't, like, as soon as the COVID broke out, I said, oh, 1918 again, or, Black Death again, pandemics, they're so critical to our history. But World War I really did overshadow that.
Okay. Joyce asked, why was the second wave so much more serious than the first? Had the virus mutated, and why was the third wave then lower?
We do know that the virus mutated and became deadlier in 1918. Our HN viruses mutate very quickly. My understanding from what I've read, again, not a virologist, is that the COVID viruses don't mutate very quickly. I think it has to do with protein structures and those little spikes on them, but I'll let you go to a science lecture on that one. So yes, it did mutate and become much deadlier in 1918. So again, as with the African American community that had pretty high rates in the first wave of the pandemic and got some immunity, and then didn't suffer as much in 1918, for other groups that kind of missed that first wave and hadn't been exposed to some of the related HN viruses that circulated previously, it was very, very deadly for them. And then by the following spring, it had mutated again and become less deadly. I always want to say, you have to think like a virus. So if your job as a virus is to survive and spread to someone or to some carrier, you can't kill them all off, or you won't be able to go on to the next group. If you kill them all off, you'll die off. So it's kind of a balance between how deadly and quickly do you want to spread, but if you spread too quickly and you are too deadly, you're going to die out. I don't want you to think like viruses, but you have to understand there's a combination of the human factors and the environmental factors and the infrastructure factors and the fact of the viruses. And of course, we didn't really look at those 1918 viruses until we were able to understand viruses and then cultivate them from bodies or surviving tissue from 1918.
Prudence asked, obviously based on history, do you think we are reopening businesses too soon currently?
Oh, I'm not going to get into predicting what we're doing. I will leave that to the public health experts. People will have to decide by looking at their public health authorities what they're doing and hope that they're making the right decision about how long you can be indoors, how much of the viral toxins you'll be exposed to, wearing a mask, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll leave that to the experts.
Okay. Mary Ann asks, did the 1918 flu really begin on a farm in the Midwest?
Well, yes, in the United States, it began in Camp Funston in Kansas. So a lot of people say we should call it the Kansas flu. But as for where that original HN virus came from before it mutated into what we had in that first wave or the second wave, I'm not going to hazard a guess. I don't think it's really known. But in the United States, it did begin in Kansas. So feel free to call it the Kansas flu rather than the Spanish flu from where it was first reported in our press as having come from.
Okay, this was a pre-submitted one. How effective then do you think public education and precautions to avoid spreading the disease were?
Oh, it's hard to measure that, isn't it? When you have 675,000 deaths in the United States, you have to say, would it have been less if people wore masks? Would it have been less if people self-quarantined? Or was it bound to be that deadly because we didn't have effective treatments and because we had medical personnel overseas, or it was just simply so deadly it would overcome whatever we did? Very difficult to go back and estimate that. As I said, probably the best we know of is there were, I believe, and the University of Michigan, I'll give them a little shout out. They have a wonderful 1918 pandemic website where they have literally every newspaper article from every paper around the country, identified these communities that self-quarantined and let no one in. And they were called escape communities. They had no flu deaths. I believe there was a community in Colorado, several colleges, some island communities. So part of it is your ability to avoid people who are sick. That's hard to do in 1918, and it's when we're an urbanizing nation, although most people lived in urban areas were counted, I think, as 3,500 or larger. Today, we're even more of an urban nation, so the challenges are very different.
Okay, Joyce has a follow-up. So we know where it started physically, but do we know the host that it originated from?
I do not. I do not know where it came from.
Okay. Robert asks, because the 1918 flu was significantly more fatal to younger folks, did the older generation take on more economic and social obligations to shield the younger generations from infection?
Well, let me remind you, this is a fast-moving epidemic. So yes, you could get up in the morning and by the end of the day, both your parents are dead. So yes, of course, grandparents stepped up, orphanages had to step up. Younger people had a high death rate, but not as high as those people in that prime working age. So if you think about it, we're a country where we shipped a lot of young men and women overseas, and we've got a lot of younger working folks dying of influenza. It did have long-term effects in terms of who had to go to work to support families, what kind of workers had to get hired. And then, of course, not too long after we get our troops back from 1918, we have our Dust Bowl on the farms. We have the start of our economic downturn that will lead to a bigger crash in 1929. But certainly the 1920s were a tough period economically as we're shading into the Great Depression. So, yes, but people did step up and help out and form organizations for orphanages or for fatherless families. They had always been there as part of a kind of volunteer network, and they were there during and after 1918.
Okay, this was a pre-submitted question. Do you know how the pandemic affected the opening of the Mabel Smith Douglas New Jersey College for Women?
No, that's a great question, and I hope you'll get a Rutgers historian on there to answer that one.
We do have, because I have seen some questions, we do have a part 2 of this tomorrow, and that's going to focus on New Brunswick and Rutgers in particular. So for some of the questions that have been specific to those 2 locations, join us tomorrow. Okay, this is a pre-submitted question. This is that essentially, can you speak on how the politicians in 1918 handled this? If you want to compare it to how it's being handled by politics today, that's up to you, or if you just want to speak in general to how it was handled.
You know, I would say a big difference between 1918 and today is that our elected officials really deferred to the public health experts on this. In part, our national leadership was focused again on World War I, entering the war, getting our troops overseas, constructing military bases and camps, getting those points of embarkation for our ships going overseas. So they were very much focused on being what we'll call wartime leaders. And our governors and others are focused on getting the economic infrastructure to build these field hospitals in communities, or our mayor building, unfortunately, the morgues and other things needed. So they're getting the funds out there to supply what's needed. But in terms of giving advice, they really did turn to the Board of Health. It was just unfortunate that here in Philadelphia, our public health leaders said, go ahead and have that parade. Today, we often, I think I'll say, we often see our president speaking about influenza and taking a more prominent role than our public health leaders at the CDC or the National Institutes of Health. I will say, on the state level, I know, I'll just speak to Pennsylvania, we do have updates issued from our city health commissioner and from Rachel Levine, our state health commissioner. But they sometimes are overshadowed by the advice coming out of Washington. Was that diplomatic enough? I hope so.
So I think it's about time to wrap up. So Janet, I don't know, before I close, is there anything you want to say sort of as final thoughts?
Yes, since I'm in the vulnerable age group, I would ask all of you to wear your masks. That's my final thought for the day. And please do stay safe and follow the advice of your state and local health commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time to give this. And I don't know, can we announce that was it 7 days away from?
7 days from retirement.
From retirement. Yeah. So Janet stepped in to do this right on sort of the last days at Rutgers. So we greatly appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
As I had said a few minutes ago, there will be a part 2 to this tomorrow at noon. The link is on the events website, the sas.rutgers.edu/events. So if you're interested in hearing more specific to New Brunswick and Rutgers, that will be tomorrow. Again, today's event was recorded. It will be on the website later today. Tomorrow's event will be recorded, so it will be on the website if you're not able to join us tomorrow. We will be sending around a survey later this afternoon. We like to ask that everyone fill it out because it helps give us ideas for future events. So I think that's it for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.